So Jay, how have you been, man?
I have been fairly well. One of the things that has happened recently is my son turned 10 in the last month. And that, a lot of my early trauma, and I would say like just when life really started going downhill for me was in fifth grade
Okay.
when I turned 10. And so it's been stirring up quite a bit, like just having my child now
Hmm.
over half of his lifetime has been spent with my wife and I. So it stirs up a lot of questions around, yeah, time with him and just my own dealing with my own 10-year-old self in the
Uh,
midst of parenting a 10-year-old. So that's been probably most in the forefront of my mind is just how am I attending to being
yeah.
a dad to this boy, but also dealing with just a lot of my own childhood stories around that particular age.
Oh, that is all too familiar because my world was the fourth, fifth grade as well. So
Oh yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's when a lot of things entered into the picture. So where I want to go with the conversation, Jay, is um, you and I do a lot of overlap of the work, a lot of the same history in some regards, personal and professional. um, and maybe even perhaps marital. There's the whole journey that there's
Hmm.
probably a lot of similarities. But when I want to just let's go through a scenario of kind of a common client we might see of a guy that's coming, and he's been introduced to pornography at some point in his childhood. It's still there. It's wreaking havoc. He's tried the traditional white knuckle it. He's tried the traditional accountability group will solve this. He's tried the
Yes. Yeah.
all the different things,
The
and I
belief
think
that
one of the
marriage will help him deal with
absolutely
this
marriage will
better,
solve it
all
because
of
now I
those
can actually
illusions.
have
Yeah.
sex. Yeah.
Yes.
But the one thing that jumps out to me is just this idea when we overlap the human condition and the route that we go down, men and women both, and then you throw into it this idea of the lust management thought
Hmm.
process. How do you make sense of those? What do talk about that, because I think that's some of the things that really resonate for me with your work.
Yeah. Yeah. So if that client were to come in and say, I have a present problem with pornography, trying to address it, uh, what I view my job as a therapist is I want to essentially construct a bridge between the present to the past. And
Okay.
until that bridge is constructed, people will inevitably either minimize their sexual problems or they will try to manage them and develop some level of mastery around them. So we want to get a sense of like, what's the origin story of this behavior? When were you first introduced to it? How has fantasy or the porn searches changed over time? And so, one of the things that we're all waking up to is just the reality of childhood trauma. And so there are, people have probably heard the distinction between a big T trauma and a small T trauma. Big T
Hmm.
trauma being 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, life or death scenarios. But then there are also other experiences that could be, mild bullying or a level of just disengagement in your family system where no one prepared you for puberty or no one prepared you
Hmm.
for just some of the emotional challenges of a prototype of hell like middle school can be. And so part of like what we have learned from people like Dr. Gabor Mate is he would say trauma is not just what happened to us. Trauma is what happens inside of us in the absence of an empathetic witness. And
Okay.
so right then we have, that sometimes the difficulties that happen to us, if we don't have a good parent, a good community around us that is attuned, present, caring to some of those difficulties, we are feeling some level of pain or trauma. And so, what happens in the midst of trauma is we need to find particular things to bring soothing and numbing to our lives. And so,
Hmm.
sometimes that boy, that man that we're dealing with clinically, may have found porn around the age of 12 or 13. And for him, it was that first experience of pleasure, connection, soothing.
Hmm.
I don't think it remains like that over the course of adulthood. I think, the
Yeah.
ways that we learn to survive eventually lead to problems later on in life.
Oh
But
yeah.
that's how I would hold that with that client is let's honor the origin story of the soothing, the attachment that you developed here, but then also let's step into you're still a bit like a 13, 14-year-old in terms of development, where you're still outsourcing your care and desire for soothing to something that's causing personal and interpersonal problems. And so let's grow a self kind of capable of moving through some of this distress instead of just relying on porn or your partner's validation. So those problems, I think, are always a roadmap to healing and growth. That's kind of the perspective that I take.
Right. So what do you do then? Because this is where it becomes so, in some ways, insidious, at least in my experience. That now you put it in the context of a marriage with a spouse who is possibly revolted by that aspect
Hmm.
of his life. And again, I
Yes.
think this can be reversed, right? With the
Yeah.
female bringing in whatever their strategy and coping and pleasure and all that, but for the sake of our conversation, we'll keep it this way that we started
Hmm.
it. But because what you're describing is actually leaning into it with far less judgment, far less
Hmm.
condemnation, and almost trying to make it human.
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
dare we in some ways? But
Precisely.
but that's where it seems to be a disconnect, right? I think as professionals we can talk about this and see it as, yeah, that's, I can understand that. But to a person just listening that has maybe gone through this, man, we react out of our pain. We had,
Hmm.
just to bring you where we've been in the show lately, we did an episode couple back, where a husband had emailed in. He's had a porn addiction, the way he described it, his entire
Hmm.
life, and he's tried to figure out how to fix it, and he's trying to figure out when should he tell his wife. His wife knew, but it's still going on, and so he asked when should he disclose to her. And my counsel was yes, but you need what really matters is the motivation for telling her, right? So
Hmm.
not necessarily right now, because a lot of times my journey was I unloaded it on Pam
Hmm.
because it made me feel better. I had no plan of how I'm going to fix it. I
Yes.
just I just freed myself of the guilt and I gave it all to her. How great and
Yes.
gracious
You
of me.
metabolize it. You deal with it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
But so some of the feedback we got from that was from wives that have been on that journey, and the pain that they emailed in with was so evident
Yeah.
because it's like, hold on a sec, this is completely wrong, this is damaging, they're living a lie, and we can react to things. And so how do we make sense of that for
Hmm.
the just people in general to kind of maybe take a little weaponizing out of it?
Hmm. Yeah, so there's going to be stages of growth here. And sometimes I break it down for couples in terms of, yeah, when all of this comes out, you're going to be in much more of the crisis or triage stage. And so the work to be done there is, I mean, it's got to be a very differentiated process where the offending partner is doing their own work to understand, like, how did I get here? Why do I
Mm-hmm.
stay here? Why was I committed to hiding and secrecy? And we understand our story not to make excuses for our behavior, but to actually take more responsibility for it. And so when I understand the why, I'm beginning to step in with more integrity to my story, which then allows me to step into more integrity with how, the harm that I brought into my marriage. But simultaneously, the person who has been betrayed, they're going to enter into their own crisis stage. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where you want to have a licensed mental health counselor working with you. And sometimes what I hear from those spouses is both a sense of betrayal trauma, but then also a sense of like something in my gut knew that something was off. And so the dual work there is, when trauma happens to us, we have a region in our brain called Broca's area. And when we are betrayed, when we enter into any form of trauma, Broca's area goes offline. And Broca's area is the region of speech, it's the region of language. So a lot of times when we first find out that our partner has this secret, we might say something like, I have no words to
Right.
describe what it
Right.
is. And that's Broca's. That's a trauma response. And so we want to
Okay.
care for that trauma. But then we also, for most spouses that I work with, and this is not in any way to blame, you know,
Right.
the partner here, but it's they usually have some sense of like, I had a feeling that something was off, but I was either gaslit or
Mm-hmm.
I suppressed what I felt like I knew. And so that
Mm-hmm.
becomes moving from the crisis triage stage much more to the meaning making stage. And so for some spouses, they might feel this sense of like, well, I'm not good enough and I can't compete with this affair partner or with this porn search. And it's a very, they're processing all of their own self-esteem issues that they have never processed. So
Right.
sometimes these sexual problems are a petri dish for both partners to work through some of the unresolved stories of their life. And so I think if you can get, let's attend to the triage, the crisis for, I don't even want to put a timeline, but I would say somewhere between 0 and 6 months. And then hopefully, if you're doing good work, 6 months on is the meaning making stages for both individual partners of
Right.
how did I get here? What do I not want to see again? What am I not going to tolerate anymore in my
Right.
marriage? And then it's more of like a recasting of a vision of what do we want for our marriage going forward that doesn't contain secrecy, but also doesn't kind of tie our whole sense of self to this person's desire choice for us, which is always a fairly precarious place when you're relying on your partner for all types of soothing and validation. We should
Yeah.
at some level, but it can become holistic and comprehensive in scope. And that's really where the enmeshment of a couple
Yeah.
inevitably has to break down in order for something new and life-giving to emerge.
Right. That's where your identity is not solely in that one dynamic. It's in
Yes.
multiples and it's in yourself, and there's elements of you grow a sacredness and a bond and a depth,
Mm.
but you don't give everything, which is, and again,
Yeah.
that's counter to, right? That's
Yeah.
counter
Because
to a
the
lot of what we think.
so much so, and that's like the meaning making stage might be, I wanted, if I am the partner that's been using porn and secret or having the affair, I mean, sometimes that is part of, after I've stepped into the betrayal, the harm, the secrecy, the gaslighting that I have done, I need to have integrity there. But then also, when you talked about the sacredness of a marriage or just the soulfulness of a marriage, it really comes when two partners are able to say, like, here's my story and how I've kind of come into this marriage, and here's your story. And now, how
Mm-hmm.
can we commit to one another? Uh, to care for one another in places that we have lacked love. And so, as an individual, I have to care for that 10-year-old self in me, that 11-year-old self in me, and I have to be in a way, the dad that I never had in that place. But
Mm-hmm.
I can also bring my wife into, when I hit really difficult moments professionally, personally, even as an adult, that's some of the self state that she's dealing with is an 11-year-old. And that's
Right.
not, you have to deal with him because I don't want him, but it's, I'm caring for him. And here are some
Right.
stories that would really help you to understand the man, but also the adolescent that you're dealing with in our marriage.
Right. And let's be crystal clear, because what you are saying, just in case this isn't being heard cleanly, it's not the spouse's responsibility to deal with our lack of whatever, or our
Yeah.
um, trauma and healing, whatever, because that's where they can be an ally, but they are not responsible
Yes.
for, in no
Yes.
way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, to Gabor Mate's point of trauma is not just a difficult traumatic moment that happens to us. It's what happens inside of us in the absence of an empathetic witness.
Yeah.
As an individual, it is my primary responsibility to be a primary witness to my story. But I'm also grateful that I have dear friends that have been empathetic witnesses to
Yeah.
some of my heartache and trauma, but also my wife. So
Yeah.
it's saying like I want to be the person that is most attuned, caring for and dealing with the implications of my story. But certainly that's not a siloed approach to life. It's
Yeah.
saying, friends, colleagues,
Yeah.
dear people in my life.
Yeah.
These are some
Yeah.
of the
Because
stories that have formed the person that you're interacting with today.
right, because this is the kind of work that you're describing, and the kind of life shift, if you will, of it's moving beyond trying to manage these things, and it's actually addressing them and tending
Hmm.
to them. Right,
Yeah,
it's
well said.
welcoming them in some ways. Right, it's heading
Hmm.
towards them. And have you come across? Um, I saw this on Instagram a couple months back, of the story of the differences between buffaloes and cows when it comes to storms. Have you heard of this? I
I don't know
actually
this.
I actually went to go search it out to make sure it wasn't
Okay.
just an Instagram, viral something that,
Do
to
cows
find.
separate and buffaloes come and bison
No,
come
no, no.
together, or
So both buffaloes and cows, when storms are coming, they can sense it,
yeah,
right? Because they're out
yeah,
in nature, and they can sense the change in the pressure, and they can sense the
yes.
impending energy. Cows run the other way
Hmm.
from it.
Hmm.
If they're out in a plain, right, where it's wide open,
Yeah.
they will run the
Hmm.
opposite direction from the way the storm is coming. Well, cows are not fast enough to outrun a storm. Let's just face that fact. But they will keep
Yeah.
running.
What's the top speed of a cow?
I don't.
I
I
don't.
did not
I've
find that.
never asked.
Maybe I need to go back and Google. So, but they'll keep running, and the storm will catch them,
Hmm.
and they'll keep running,
Yeah.
and the storm will stay on them, and they'll keep running, and they stay in the storm. Whereas buffaloes, when they
Okay.
sense the storm, they run at it.
Hmm.
And even though it's
Yeah.
scary running at it, they will get through
Hmm.
it faster and reap the benefits of it on the other side, which is,
Hmm.
the moisture, the growth, the refreshing, everything, which is an incredibly exquisite analogy of trauma
Yes.
and stress
Hmm.
and hurt and pain, that
Hmm.
we think we want to just run from it. But
Yes.
reality is we got to run towards it.
Hmm. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. I go a couple places there. Um, there's a spearfisher woman by the name of Kimmy Werner, and I can't remember if I talked about her on the show last time.
It's worth
But she
revisiting
gets
if you
in
didn't. So go
she
ahead.
gets into the waters. She's a spearfisher, and on one breath can go into depths of about 100 feet. And when you're spearfishing, you get your catch, your prey, and then the sharks can actually smell the blood from the fish that you've just caught. So the sharks start coming in to try and steal her fish. And that's what she says as well in this Patagonia film, Fish People, is she says something along the lines of like, when a shark is trying to steal her catch, she says, "Not today, buddy," and she
Yeah.
swims directly at the shark and pushes it away, just to tell it like, "Not today, this dinner is mine." And again, that's a very trained response, because
Yes, it
limbically
is.
our amygdala is actually that fight, flight, freeze, fawn approach. So it does take some good care to understand your self state, to understand like, this is my natural inclination, is I want to run. But I have learned that if I run, it actually creates more chaos. So I'm actually going to turn and face this thing. So I
Right.
love that language. The poet John O'Donohue, in one of his writings to a friend who is dealing with a terminal illness, said something along the lines of, "May you find in yourself a courageous hospitality for all that is, miserable or difficult inside of you." And I think that's what we're getting at, is this is miserable. It sucks. It's full of
Yeah.
shame. It can be
Yeah.
full of isolation and loneliness, but will you commit to a courageous hospitality for these stories and for the difficulty of your marriage? And over time, not all at once, this courageous hospitality begins to bring soul and healing and goodness and flourishing to your life.
Yeah, yeah, because that's that element. You use the wording of curious, of wholeness, and those are things that we have. In some ways, they're counterintuitive. In some ways, they require a decision, of a turning towards, of a seeking out. Whereas I think our humanness is oftentimes, how do I just make it go away?
Hmm. Yep.
Right? How
Yep.
do I put this behind me, knowing, oh,
Hmm.
sure, if I can just outrun this, it will never bother me again, which total farce. Does it
Yes.
happen in life? Because everything has a tendency to come back and creep in. And so I love just the whole framework of seeing it as being curious about your journey, your story. What
Hmm.
role did it play? What was the
Hmm.
importance of it back when it entered, and then as it grew or evolved or shaped? Because again, that's that element of, I heard this in school, our coping mechanisms made sense when we created them, but they don't
Hmm.
typically make sense later.
Yes. Yep. And that's really, I mean, that's what we have to be intellectually honest about is, if we take something like trauma or pain or heartache, and we say what happens to that is that that pain, that heartache is too much for most of us to deal with. And so
Mm-hmm.
inevitably the next stage is numbing. And so it's not just that you're running from the reality, it's that the human condition needs to be able to find some suppressant of that pain. And so that
Yeah,
could be alcohol, drugs, substance abuse, Netflix, but something that allows the pain, the difficulty, the overwhelm to be reduced. And then the thing that you rely on for rescue then becomes the master over you. And that's when it leads to all of these problems. So you might think that running is helping you, but if you are actually honest about you can't just run away from something. You're
right.
also simultaneously developing faith, trust in some other process to help you. And then it's that question of how is that newfound faith, newfound trust actually working for you with
Right.
that type of Netflix, substance abuse, whatever that is. We don't typically remain neutral in these places.
No, but I also like how you're confirming the idea that all of us medicate in some way, shape, or form for the
Hmm.
hurts and the ails of life,
Hmm.
and then it just becomes, how do I move it up the healthy scale
Yes. Yep.
of what I choose to do to get a break, to have a reprieve, even to escape a little bit, because I think there's elements of times of life where it's like, I just need to escape to the back porch
Hmm.
and breathe for a little bit out of the chaos.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Sometimes I'll have clients that I can remember. One client was talking about going to this was when I was in Seattle, was at a Seattle Mariners game watching the Orioles or something, and some batter had struck out like 3 times in a game, and he had said something like that hadn't happened since Camden Yards back in 2012. And I was like, how do you know that? And for him, it wasn't porn. It was just like a level of mastery that he found some realm of life where he had complete control and dominion. So
Yeah.
it could be some type of mastery approach to life, or for others, it's more of like an indulging of something. But you're right. The what is your back porch? I was having some issues with my teeth a couple days ago, and I've had just some teeth issues through the years, and something kind of broke off from some dental treatment, and my whole body just shut down. Like
Yeah.
I was in a trauma response in a way. And so we have one of those weighted blankets. And that was
Yeah.
part of what I had to sleep with was like, I just need weight. I need a level of containment for myself just because I did not feel grounded. And
Yeah.
so whether it's a back porch, fly fishing, a weighted blanket, but like what brings rest, restoration, goodness to your heart and soul is really what we have to prioritize when we're in these difficult places.
Yeah, because this is that element of, how am I looking out for myself? How am I also looking out for what I care for? Because I think of this on a relational context, right? That if we're talking about this within that framework, there's there's dual work going on, there's dual impact going on, there's dual realities going on, and that's where it gets so conflicted and escalated,
Hmm.
even, because you're dealing with this framework of, I'm trying to take care of my life in close proximity to somebody else that will have impact on me, and vice versa.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I was just aware of, I was working with a client a couple weeks ago where just that sense, and let me know if this is what you're getting at, but their choice to pursue self-care just created a lot of conflict in their marriage because it was that sense of like, why do you get oxygen? I've been
Right.
working hard around the house. I've been working hard here. And so like now that you're making this good decision, but what about
Right.
me? And
Right.
that's that sense of, when you get on an airplane, please secure your own oxygen mask before securing the oxygen masks of others. And that ought to be a question that's asked of, you know, your spouse really
Mm-hmm.
consistently is like,
Mm-hmm.
where are you going to pursue good care, self care? Where am I going to pursue it? And this is not a competition.
Right.
There is
Right.
room for both of us to pursue space and rest because for me, that's like going out into the woods. For my wife, that's often going to like an art museum and having 2 or 3 hours in a coffee shop to read and write. We're very different, but we both kind of mutually scheme to make sure that we have what we need.
Yeah.
Because I think we're much better partners and lovers when we're both experiencing oxygen instead of deprivation.
Oh, Jay, this has been a joy to catch up with you again. Um, so thank you so much for the time, dude.
Likewise, thanks for having me back on, Corey. Enjoyed it.